Okay, now let's look on to some more interesting orders. These are the Psycoptera through the Hemipterans. So let's start with the Psycoptera. Psycoptera are the wood lice, or the bark lice, or the book lice. So psychos means rubbed or gnawed, and ptera means wings. This has to do with the way that they feed. Now, the Psycoptera are very abundant worldwide, but they're often overlooked. Whenever we have these overlooked organisms, it means that they don't have a lot of impact on animals or on humans or on things that we care about. So they're not really pests in our mind. They don't do a lot of real damage. They can cause some damage, but they're not as annoying to us as other organisms. So they tend to be overlooked. These are the most primitive types of lice. We consider this simply because their mouth parts show very little modification from that basic mandibulate condition. So if you think about those mandibles that we had you dissect in lab and that I showed you in lecture several times, these look almost exactly the same. So they've got that labrum, that labium, the mandibles, the maxillae, the palps, that clipus, all of that sort of stuff. All there. The main difference is they have what is called that expanded clipus. So remember that clipus is attached to that upper lip, that labrum area. Okay? And so this means that they have a very large, prominent head. So this is how I always remembered them when I was learning this. Was, you think psycho, head, large head, there we go. They have that expanded clipus. So really large prominent head, really expanded clipus is the major characteristic for the book lice, the bark lice, the wood lice. They live in moist terrestrial environments. So they live on land. They need a lot of water simply because they are very small and they have a pretty permeable cuticle. So we'll find them a lot in leaf litter. We'll find them under stones, under bark, hence the name bark lice, all of that sort of stuff. They very rarely come into contact with humans or with animals, and they almost never cause economic damage. Every once in a while, they will get into books, hence the name book lice, because they can feed on that cellulose, on that paper. But they're not really that common. So we don't do a lot of stuff with them. What is interesting about them is they have excellent powers of dispersal. So they can go from place to place very easily. They have very, very adapted wings or large wings. They can move quickly. So they're usually among the first insects to colonize new, what we call islands. So an island, when we talk about this in an ecological sense, can be, just a body of land amongst a bunch of water. Sure, that's an island. If a new one comes up, the Psycoptera can be among the first to go there. But an island is also considered a new little area where there's nothing else in it inside a normal habitat. So if you have, say, a new burned out place or a disturbed habitat, let's say a fire came through, burned everything, nothing is living there, that's considered an island among a normal habitat. So the Psycoptera are often the first ones to go right back there. They can move very quickly, and they do, and so they're the first to, or among the first, to colonize these new islands or invade disturbed habitats. All right. Now, a much more common type of louse is the Therapura. These are known as lice. So they're not any specific type of lice, whatever. So the PHTHIR, that literally means lice. So we named these things lice in the Greek and the Latin. Aptera means wingless, so they do not have wings. These are lice without wings, unlike the Psycoptera, which have wings. So they're very closely related to Psycoptera, but they do not have those wings, so we changed them into this new group or this new order. Now, the lineage of the Therapura has changed a lot over time. I'm going to teach you the more simplistic lineage or the more simplistic breakup of this group, simply because a lot of the basic veterinary literature, a lot of the papers that you're going to read, a lot of the stuff you're going to come across for these lice break it up this way. If you get into medical entomology, if you've taken it with me, or if you get into higher entomological classes, you're going to find that we break these up very differently later on. I want you to know what you are going to read in your veterinary textbooks. I want you to know what you're going to read in the literature that you're going to be picking up when you work in the field with animals. So that's how I'm going to teach it here, but know that there are different classifications for this. It really doesn't matter. It all ends up with the same species anyhow. But we divide these into two suborders that I want you to know for this class. The first is called Hemiptera. These are the sucking lice. So these will feed on blood. And the Malophaga. These are called the chewing lice. Now, it's that Malophaga that is being debated by some people. Some people will break it up into a whole bunch of different types. So you'll have Hemiptera plus 3 others or 4 others or 2 other orders or suborders in this case. I want you to know Hemiptera and Malophaga simply because Malophaga comes up most often in the literature in your potential field of study. Okay, so the distinction between these two is based on the presence or the absence of mandibles. Mandibles for chewing versus a cone like a piercing and sucking mouth part. Okay, so presence or absence of mandibles. So the chewing lice, as you might imagine, have large, well-developed mandibles. The sucking lice have a cone-like mouth part that is for piercing and sucking. So Hemiptera versus Malophaga. Now, the lice do vector some diseases. They can cause a lot of problems in animals. So those of you who work with animals on a regular basis, you will find these on pretty much every fur-bearing mammal has some sort of highly adapted louse that will attach to its fur. And if you remember back a couple of weeks ago, we talked about some of these adaptations of parasitic organisms, and one of the major adaptations was in the claw or in the tarsi of these animals that had to, or these insects that had to hang on to fur as ectoparasites. So if you look at these tarsi here, you can see that they got these obvious claws, and that's very different from the obvious claws on these chewing lice. So it's sucking lice, chewing lice. So you can look at these claws to see where they're going to be hanging on. So every fur-bearing animal has a very highly adapted louse. And in lab, you're going to get examples of lots and lots of different Malophaga, lots of different chewing lice that they can you can see under the microscope. And these will come from cattle, from dogs, from cats, from goats, from sheep. They all have their own adapted thing. All right, so very adapted. Now, they can spread disease. Like I said, they can vector disease. There are some pretty common human-borne diseases that are louse-borne, that are louse-vectored. One is pretty common in wartime. We call it trench fever. It was very, very common in World War I. It was spread by body lice as soldiers were forced to live in very crowded and unsanitary conditions. So these lice would move from person to person. They traveled via direct contact, and so they would vector on this trench fever. So there are a couple of other diseases that you will read about, but you'll be able to read about those. Finally, the egg stage of the louse. These eggs are called nits. These nits are, you can see it right here. And the way that these nits are laid is the female will spend her entire life on the host, and she will lay individual eggs, usually on individual hairs. So she will take this special, very, very tough glue, and she will glue the eggs to the individual hair or the individual fur strands of the animal or of the human. So if you are trying to get rid of a lice infestation, you have to get rid of not only the adults and the nymphs, but you also have to get rid of these eggs. And these eggs are tough. That glue is very strong. Those eggs are highly, highly sclerotized, so they're hard to kill. A lot of chemicals don't penetrate them, so you have to physically remove them.
Salen los piojos, ni que fuera, parece caspa la weá.
Ay, espérate, se calentaba.
Mira, y están todos vivos, si se mueven. Oh, la cagó.
Ya te voy a echar el líquido para que vaya.
All right. Now on to a very tiny organism that we call the Psycoptera. So you've seen Thyssen before. You remember Thyssen? That means fringed. So Thyssen was Thyssen with the fringed tails, the fire brats and the silverfish. Now we're talking Psycoptera, which are fringed wings. These are commonly known as thrips, and they have these wings, you can see them up here, forewings and hind wings, that are not like any other wing we've seen before. Instead, they're very paddle-like. So they're these straight, stick-like wings with fringe hanging off of them, hence the name fringe wings. Now, Psycoptera, or the thrips, are very tiny organisms. They are all well under 3 millimeters long, sometimes even smaller. And most of the species will feed on plants. So these are a plant feeder, a phytophagous insect. They cause a lot of problems with agriculture. So you can get a lot of thrip-borne diseases. You can get a lot of thrips damage. So when I say the word thrips, the word thrips is both singular and plural. So there's no such thing as a thrip. It's a thrips. And then thrips. You know, that's how we go. So these thrips are very, very tiny, and they feed by scraping the surface of plants off. So you might have seen at farmers markets or places like that, especially on fruit, you might see some damage on the outside of the fruit, in oranges or in apples or whatever, that looks sort of like a scraping damage. It's usually a brown plaque-like damage on the outside of this fruit. That's thrips damage. So these are these little tiny organisms. Now, what's interesting about thrips is they fly in a very different manner. If you look at those wings, they look like they can't fly, right? There's no way they can get lift. Well, remember what we said about that really high surface to volume ratio? When we get to this size, they are so incredibly tiny. Their relationship with air is very different from larger organisms. So they really have no relationship with gravity at this point. They're so small, and that surface to volume ratio is so high that gravity will not pull them down. So they don't have to worry about actually getting lift and trying to break the bonds of that physical force of gravity. And the air itself is so thick around them, it's like they're swimming. So if you think more about, are these swimming paddles versus lifting wings, then yeah, you can see how these things can move. So these swimming paddles, you could easily paddle through a pool with these sorts of things, and that's basically the way that thrips fly. They paddle through the air as if they are swimming through water. So they swim around through this air, and they can get from place to place very, very efficiently. So they can cause a lot of problems when it comes to agriculture, and they can spread plant disease. If you go on to a plant class or a crop insect class, you're going to learn about thrips like mad, because they do cause a lot of problems. They cause a lot of damage, and a lot of disease can be spread. A lot of cosmetic damage can happen, which means you can't sell the fresh produce. All right. The last order we're going to be looking at today is the Hemipterans. Hemi means half, and ptera means wings. So the Hemipterans are a group that we call the true bugs. So if you've ever talked to an entomologist and you've talked to them about quote-unquote bugs, you may have seen us twitch a little bit. This is because not all insects are considered bugs in our world, but all bugs are considered insects. So the only thing that we officially call bugs are Hemipterans. That's why you get that little eye twitch when you talk to an entomologist and say, "Hey, yeah, I found this beetle. Look at this bug," and we can just go, "It's not a bug. That's Coleoptera. That's a beetle." That's because we have an order that we call the true bugs. Now, this Hemiptera, this is an interesting order. It's named for the wings, hence the name Hemiptera, or half wing. So hemi means half, ptera means wings. They have these four wings that are very leathery and very sheath-like. So they have these half and half wings, while the bottom half of those hind wings are membranous in general. So this allows a lot of these orders to fly, and it gives some protection to these orders. This is pretty much a catch-all order. So you're going to see a ridiculous number of weird-looking bugs in this particular group. So we have everything in this group from these plant feeders, down here, look at these half wings, these plant feeders here, they're phytophagous, to predators. These are what we call toe biters or giant water insects. These, right around this time of year, will actually fly out and about. You might see these around your porch light if you live near water. You can see these really large water bugs. This is a male that carries its young on its back, its eggs on its back. These are plant hoppers here, plant feeders. This is a tree hopper. Look at that crazy elytra going on there, this crazy wings and this little horn right here. Then we have these looking things. These are called scale insects. This is the cottony cushion scale. Looks like no bug you've ever seen before. You can barely even see that it has legs, let alone head, thorax, and abdomen. And then this one, this is the insect that produces a casing over itself, and it sits underneath these casings on these plants. So it doesn't even, you can't even see the insect part of it. It's just this solid casing. So everything looks very, very strange. And it runs the gamut of what they feed on. So a lot of them are plant feeders, but others are predatory. Others will feed on blood. Others can spread disease. So we do have vectors of plant and animal disease in this group. It's just this huge, huge thing. Now, this group includes things like the kissing bug and the bed bug. So we will be talking about Hemiptera later on, especially with the kissing bug and Chagas disease and all that sort of stuff that's coming up. But the bed bug, we won't spend a lot of time talking about because that's more of a human problem. But if you come into my medical entomology class, we will talk a lot about bed bugs. You've probably heard about it in the news. They are in this particular order. Now, those that feed on plants, those organisms tend to feed on the liquid of plants in this group. So they have those piercing and sucking mouth parts. They will tap into the xylem and into the phloem, depending on their setup, their life history. So remember, back to your basic biology, you got the xylem and the phloem. The xylem carries water in plants. The phloem carries all that sap in plants. So if you think about it, that's a really, really high quality meal for these organisms. But that's a lot of liquid coming in too. And so this is one of those insects that I talked about early on, where I said that, we go through that crop, the foregut, the midgut, the hindgut. The hindgut is responsible for reabsorbing a bunch of water, and then they poop out, usually dry poop. Those insects that feed on liquid do not get rid of dry fecal matter. They have so much liquid coming in that water is not a problem for them. So their hindgut doesn't absorb all of the water possible. Instead, they will end up urinating out, usually a really sugary substance called honeydew. So this honeydew is this true bug or other insect urine-like substance, very, very high in sugars, very, very high in liquid. It's a sticky, sap-like or honey-like substance. If you've ever parked your car underneath a tree that has a lot of cicadas on it, cicadas are in this Hemipteran group, or other plant feeders, and you come back and there's like sticky crap all over your car, all that syrup stuff, that's honeydew. That is insect urine. So they've just basically been peeing all over your car, and it's everywhere. So this honeydew is actually a great food source for a lot of other animals. Ants go crazy for honeydew. I mean, think about it, it's just syrup, so they love it. Other organisms will go crazy for honeydew because it's a really high quality, high concentrated form of sugars that these true bugs have liberated from the plants. They've taken what they needed, and they've let the rest go onto your car or wherever else. Awesome. All right. With that, let me know if you have any questions.